Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, APAC Tech Policy Trends, AI, Data Privacy, and Emerging Regulations. My name is Annika von Gray, and I'm your moderator today. I am a senior consultant here at FiscalNote. FiscalNote empowers the world's leading organizations with critical insights and the tools to turn them into action. FiscalNote combines technology, data, and insights to help you stay ahead of political and business risks. You can learn more about FiscalNote by visiting fiscalnote.com. Now, before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes. We will be recording this session and we'll share it with you via email later this week. We also highly encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will be sure to get to as many of your questions as possible during our conversation today. We do have a lot to discuss, and we'll be discussing the digital and technology policy priorities that are emerging across key APAC markets and what they mean for your organization. Now, I'm very excited about our panelists today. Joining me are two experts in the area. We have Mikhail Khitiroglu, who is a global policy advisor here at FiscalNote, and Rohil Vaidya, who is a research analyst also at FiscalNote. So welcome to you all, and thanks for being here. As I mentioned, we have a pretty dense discussion today, so I'd love to just get started. And we'll start with our panelists. I'd love to hear about you, your background in the area, etc. So I will start it by handing the mic over to Mikhail for an introduction.
Yes, thank you, Annika. Thanks for having me here. I am Mikhail Khitiroglu, Global Policy Advisor at FiscalNote. My main area of focus is East Asia. I have an academic background in Chinese studies, and I am especially interested in tech developments and data privacy.
Thank you. Rohil, I'll hand it over to you for the same thing.
Thank you, Annika. So hello, everyone. I'm Rohil Vaidya, and I'm a research analyst at FiscalNote. I specialize in global policy analysis with a focus on the APAC region. My background is in international relations, and I also have a background in natural sciences.
Lovely. Thank you for that. So let's get started. I'm really excited about today's discussion. And I want to start with sort of a broad question. I want to know, what are the specific cybersecurity challenges that are being faced by APAC nations today due to the growth of AI? And Rohil, I'll hand it over to you to start us off here.
Yeah, Annika, thank you. So I see two separate regimes of how APAC countries are understanding and dealing with cybersecurity challenges. For developing countries, the growth of AI represents major challenges in terms of data privacy and human rights, especially for regions with large populations. While AI can benefit greatly from the large data samples and data sets that are available, especially in increasingly digital economies, large-scale data breaches and misuse is also possible, making governance quite a big challenge. The greatest threat that these kinds of countries and countries as a whole seem to have identified across the region is that of deepfakes, misinformation, and propaganda. My sense of it is that these will be treated separately from other uses of AI and will probably involve regulations on the responsible use of media and maybe greater regulation for social media. But for other uses of AI, for instance, in terms of political analysis, for instance, or legal analysis, or even in the financial space, I don't see that quite mapping onto this in the same way, except in terms of data privacy. For developed or increasingly developed countries like Malaysia and South Korea, which are already large digital economies, and high-tech sector is already in place, cybersecurity questions have been prioritized in the past, which means guidelines around AI ethics and cybersecurity have kind of flowed naturally, where regimes and regulatory expectations were already in place. Since two broad regulations might restrict important business activities, leading countries perform sort of a balancing act with an industry that is very new and has a lot of potential and is finding active use cases in the global economy, but also has the potential for serious privacy concerns and wide-scale data breaches. So overall, I understand countries as trying to remain business and innovation friendly, And depending on where they are in the tech ladder and how much they've already done the work in terms of, especially in terms of high-tech manufacturing, while maintaining existing legal and regulatory consistency. So this would help not public lobbies and public interests, as well as business interests, in understanding how these regulations develop without causing too much disruption.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Sitting on this sort of nexus of public action and private impact, I'd love to understand how APAC countries are holding tech companies accountable for breaches in digital ethics and compliance. What kind of frameworks are being considered to enhance digital accountability? And Mikhail, I'll hand this one over to you.
Yes, thank you, Annika. So it really depends on the country because they all have their own way to go around these things. The important thing to keep in mind is that while they do want to make sure that data breaches occur as rarely as possible, at the same time they don't want to penalize excessively these companies because in many cases they are domestic technology companies. They want them to be able to stay competitive internationally. If we look at specific cases, so for example, with Korea, there was recently a very big telecom data breach in Korea, the SK Telecom one. What like the decision that was reached was that they imposed a very light financial penalty on the company, but at the same time they did force the company to take very advanced security measures, invest heavily in digital security, hire a specialist team of advisors, coordinate closely with the government, and also implement some government oversight. If we look, on the other hand, at Japan, the Japanese framework is more company friendly, I would say, in that the framework does not specify specific penalties for breaches. It is more focused on self-regulation of the companies, and any sanctions for data breaches are decided on a case-by-case basis. Finally, if we look at Taiwan, like the data breaches in Taiwan, have often been the case of foreign state actors, such as hackers from China. So the government is very interested in enhancing the defenses of the Taiwanese companies against this kind of foreign interference.
Great. Thank you. Sounds like there's a bit of a patchwork approach that's evolving here. I'm thinking about India right now and the recent push for digital public infrastructure. Rohil, how is tech policy evolving to support AI in such platforms while maintaining the focus on addressing privacy and in competition concerns more broadly?
Right. So India is a particularly interesting case when it comes to the regulation of tech and within digital public infrastructure, because Aadhaar and UPI are kind of the two big examples that India has. Aadhaar is kind of the national ID system where everybody has a number and a name and biometric information. And UPI is is this QR code you scan to make payments. So initially, when Aadhaar was brought in, it was supposed to be a very limited system which would only service government provided services like government provided food or medical relief or in cases of disaster management. But over time, we've seen the government try to expand the use of Aadhaar to private sector users as well. Now, this has faced legal challenge because the original legislation that brought the Aadhaar into place rather specifically mentions its use case being limited to government services to avoid issues of pilferage or corruption. So Aadhaar has found is in this, I wouldn't quite call it a limbo, but this space where it's still pretty limited. But the government does try to find ways of bringing it out into other uses. For instance, linking your Aadhaar is necessary to have a phone number, to file your income tax returns. So you'll also have it attached to your income tax ID and so on. Where UPI comes in is more interesting because the RBI, which is the Central Bank of India, or the Reserve Bank of India for the acronym, recently published a report with the full name of which is Framework for Responsible and Ethical Enablement of Artificial Intelligence. And the acronym is Free AI, which kind of describes what they're batting for, where the idea was to study how AI can be implemented in financial services. And their most important principle that they suggested businesses follow and governments follow as well is innovation over restraint. Now, this signals a fairly business-friendly approach where the RBI is willing to allow lighter regulation as long as businesses stay relevant and responsible, and then develop innovation in the financial sector. A second important change in the legislative environment in India was the Jan Vishwas Act, which translates to the People's Confidence Act. While it wasn't specific to AI, it was broadly about how businesses are punished for either falling afoul of the law or for breaching public trust. So a vast range of business punishments were decriminalized and reduced to fines, largely indicating a fairly business friendly sentiment where the government doesn't want to be seen in opposition to business interests and business innovation, but rather in partnership, where they want people to innovate. And if they do make mistakes and if businesses do run afoul of the law, it doesn't lead to criminal proceedings, but rather civil proceedings. So that important distinction was made recently. As far as AI and privacy are concerned, the main legislation where all regulations, I believe, will stem from is called the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which was passed in 2023. It's a fairly introductory act and foundational, where it gives citizens the power to control the information that they put into digital spaces as data controllers. And it also assigns responsibilities to what are known as data fiduciaries who control and manage data. So it's fairly similar to a lot of global frameworks around data privacy. While current AI regulation doesn't quite exist, and the report from the RBI is kind of the only comprehensive example I know of, I would imagine future AI regulation would draw heavily from the DPDP Act, the Data Protection Act. So India is interesting because it has a very large population, and it is increasingly digitally connected. So I would imagine AI businesses are very interested in seeing how it develops, how the framework and the environment develops in India. While the government isn't giving a lot away right now, I do imagine it will become a conversation in the future.
Thank you for that really insightful answer. It seems like tensions and relationships between platforms and regulators are really evolving in different ways in different contexts. I want to shift focus for a moment to South Korea and sort of think about some of these tensions, especially with app store fees, algorithmic transparency, things of that nature. Mikhail, is South Korea aligning more with the EU model, or do you find that they're kind of carving out their own approach to the topic?
Yes, well, Annika, that's an interesting question. I would say that not originally, but as of 2024, according to the legal framework that existed in Korea, it did seem to align closer, let's say, at least to the EU standards. But what we've noticed in recent months is as there has been a lot of legislative activity and discussions in the parliament of South Korea, and the aim is to make the legal framework more business friendly. So that kind of diverges slightly from the original closeness to the EU standards. This is the result of international competition from the US mostly. So South Korea is really pressing to prioritize the development of its own domestic AI solutions. Also regarding app store fees, the government is really concerned about US dominance in the area with most users, as is the case globally, relying on Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store. So they are giving incentives for the development of local solutions. Yes. Now, regarding mm, regarding the excuse me, what was the second part of the question? I think I missed that.
No worries, and there's a lot to cover here, so you can kind of take this where you want to. But I was really curious about, again, this platform regulator tension, and I was thinking about app store fees and also algorithmic transparency within that context.
Yes. So concerning algorithmic transparency, thank you for reminding me. The regulators are concerned about bias, so they would like companies to be more sensitive to South Korean needs, cultural content. They are very in favor of prioritizing so-called K content and the Korean wave, and would and also give incentives for the development of and dissemination of this kind of content to users in Korea, definitely. A second aim of the regulators is to also promote this kind of content internationally through the app stores to non-domestic users.
Thank you. Thank you for that intricate answer. We're covering a lot of ground here, sort of thematically and geographically, and I'm going to keep up with that pace now and sort of shift our lens to a different jurisdiction. I'm thinking about Indonesia here and their 2024 elections, which saw some increased scrutiny on online platforms and disinformation. Rohil, has this led to a shift in how Indonesia is approaching regulating AI?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because Indonesia is a very online country. One of the things you often see when following Indonesia and their digital regulation is they're quite proud of the uptake of social media, the uptake of streaming services within the general population. What this does obviously open is also an issue for governments to regulate how misinformation and now increasingly AI-generated content spreads within these spaces. It's interesting that while the government has often made comments on it, you'll often see ministers and sometimes the president talking about the need to strongly regulate these kinds of misinformation. The actual regulatory content that they've released has been fairly liberal and quite in line with the rest of the region. So ASEAN, which is the group of Southeast Asian nations, released an AI ethics guideline. And then Indonesia quickly followed suit and released two important documents and released public consultations on them. One was the National Artificial Intelligence Roadmap, which was a white paper, and the draft Artificial Intelligence Ethics Guidelines. So the roadmap was more to serve as a forward-looking, a future-looking document that would allow public interests and businesses to understand where the Indonesian government wants to take AI regulation and what kinds of businesses they see finding root in the country. And the AI ethics guideline was more specific, talking about the kinds of limitations they would like to impose on AI businesses and AI activities. The guidelines do still read as a fairly light touch approach where it is business trust first, and only in cases of the breach of any such trust would the government step in and carry out some kind of investigation or punishing action. So Indonesia follows almost India's example in that way, where they're both fairly open to business interests, but there is kind of a red line which isn't communicated directly, but will come up on a case-by-case basis. And what we'll also imagine as large tech companies come in, there would be specific understandings and agreements between ministers and people from these companies, which would lay down the groundwork for these kinds of regulatory environments.
Interesting. I want to zoom in on a similar note to what's going on in Malaysia, which has, of course, been pretty long-term investment destination for tech businesses in the region. How is Malaysia bringing AI into recent conversations, developments, etc., around regulating the same topic?
Right. So, I mean, yeah, as you said, Malaysia has for a long time been an investment destination for foreign businesses. Here, it plays kind of a balancing act between the US and China, where billions of dollars worth of investment have come into the country from American businesses like Nvidia and Google and Microsoft, and also Chinese businesses like ByteDance. So, as China increasingly becomes more influential in the tech space, they will also export a lot of investment opportunities to countries like Malaysia and generally within the Southeast Asian nation. So Malaysia has been trying to keep up and has been releasing constant documents and statements and public releases of their plans for the future. One has been massive investments in data centers, which they believe will lead to higher paying jobs for the country at large. Now, this is a part of their broader 13th Malaysia plan, which has a time frame of 5 years from 2026 to 2031, which aims to redesign human development, where the idea is that Malaysia as a whole will see this lift all boats approach, where everybody's standard of living will go up due to investments in high tech and cloud technologies. A particularly ambitious policy that was recently published last month was the National Cloud Computing Policy, which aims to comprehensively digitize not only governance, but also private public partnerships and bring everything that is currently done within governance and within regulation to some kind of cloud-based technology, which they project would improve governance and efficiency and the effectiveness of governance increasingly, and would also allow people increased mobility in cases where, especially documentation is sparse or can get destroyed, is one of their big challenges that they're trying to solve with this. Another interesting statement that was made by the president, by the prime minister, was an aim to increase Malaysia's high-tech exports, almost doubling them to 1 trillion in value, which is around 238 US dollars, where it currently sits at 600 billion in Malaysian currency. So it's increasingly obvious that Malaysia is setting itself up as the next high-tech destination in Southeast Asia. This would obviously mean increased investments from China, because as US investments become more and more tricky to understand, become more unpredictable, Malaysia might have to obviously cater to the Chinese investment base as well. And just in terms of regulation of AI in high tech, they have a fairly comprehensive personal data protection department, which looks after all sorts of personal data personal data uses, personal data concerns. And they recently released a AI ethics guideline, which was very similar to the Indonesian one, fairly modeled on the ASEAN guide. And they also released a public consultation on ADMP guidelines, where ADMP stands for Automated Decision Making Profiling, which is highly related to AI, where the idea is that in any case, decisions are made in a digital manner without the involvement of a human being. Certain privacy measures need to be followed. So the public consultation ended on the 19th of May earlier this year. So it will be a few more months before we see the finalized guidelines published, at least. But it does signal an interest in developing a world-class infrastructure and regulatory environment around high-tech and AI in the country. And consistent efforts are clearly being made by the government to at least signal an intent to be at par with existing high-tech destinations like the EU and the US and China.
Great, thank you. Sounds like those developments will be really interesting to watch as they become formalized. And that's a nice segue into my next curiosity. Tech governance and innovation is very quickly becoming a nucleus of global competition conversations. And I really have my mind on the rising US-China tech competition landscape. How are various APAC countries managing pressure from both sides? Does it feel like they're leaning towards non-alignment, strategic hedging, or taking sides? Mikhail, maybe I'll start with you with this question with a focus on East Asia.
Yes, well, so it really depends on if a country is already at the forefront of technological development, such as Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and South Korea, or is currently trying to uh, catch up and develop its own technology sector, such as most of the Southeast Asian countries. Now, until recently, until like a couple of years ago, um, many of the companies, the leading domestic companies of these countries, have had manufacturing facilities in China, in mainland China. But following a string of trade secret leaks, uh, they have decided to switch to reshoring and moving manufacturing back to their home countries. So they, for example, South Korean and Taiwanese companies have moved their high-tech manufacturing back to the relevant countries while keeping the more non-specialized manufacturing facilities in mainland China. Now, regarding the China and US trade competition, I would say that these countries have attempted to follow a middle ground between them, while prioritizing their own domestic industry. However, recently, due to the US administration tariff policy, there has been a shift in this with companies from South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan pledging to move a large part of their manufacturing to the US in order to address these trade restrictions that they're facing. Yes. So regarding Southeast Asia, I think I can hand over to Rohil to continue.
Yeah, thanks, Mikhail. So I broadly agree with the general sentiment towards the end, where the US has been quite insistent on moving a lot of technology manufacturing back into the US. For South and Southeast Asia, it can broadly be described as strategic hedging, where three examples I can give where countries are in different stages of that hedging. Malaysia is still very much in kind of the doldrums of hammering a deal out with the US. They have a fairly high tariff rate against them. They rely heavily on US investments into the region. So they're looking quite keenly at placating the US and ensuring those investment streams don't dry up. An example of this was a recent disagreement between the two countries was AI chips that were manufactured in the US were finding their way to China and were being mislabeled as being exported to Malaysia. So very recently, the Malaysian government added those chips to their strategic list, making sure they can't be exported without the express permission of the Ministry of Trade, basically increasing the scrutiny that is applied to the trade of these chips. So small concessions have been made, and trade conversations are always on in the background. Indonesia, on the other hand, was able to successfully achieve a deal before the second round of tariffs came in and established a 19% reciprocal tariff rate. How this directly translates to investments into Indonesia is yet to be seen, because Indonesia is still driven by its automotive manufacturing and is looking to expand its high-tech manufacturing. India, on the other hand, has found the other end of the stick where the US has put a 50% tariff rate on India, where 25% of that was due to oil dealings with Russia. So now India is making overtures to with Russia, as it did in the past, and thawing relationships with China, signaling its interest in diversifying investment streams. Now, I do disagree with a lot of US commentators on this, where they seem to have the opinion that the US has lost India. I don't believe that is the case. India and most South and Southeast Asian countries have for long maintained a fairly flexible foreign policy in terms of trade, where they are willing to trade despite differences in politics, in ideology, or even historical disputes. So I don't see India as completely turning towards East Asia or the Asian bloc. And I do see a potential thaw with the US possible. But yeah, broadly speaking, I agree with Mikhail, where the US is rather set on ensuring big tech stays home. So for countries that have manufacturing plants in China and are exporting to the US, we will see a shift where they will try to either manufacture at home and have a domestic deal with the US, or they will try to move manufacturing back into the US at the expense of China. But at the same time, I don't think China would be extremely worried about these movements because they have a strong domestic manufacturing base of their own, and they're still able to provide significant benefits to countries in the region that are looking to invest and to businesses in the region looking to invest. So it is a very interesting space to watch how the US responds to the different movements that businesses from different countries make. And yeah, I think it'll be an interesting next few years.
Certainly will be interesting to watch. Thank you for those insightful answers. I want to remind our watchers that we do have an open Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have curiosities and questions that arise as you're listening to us, please pop them in there and we will definitely make time to address them. And I actually want to move over to some questions that we've already received. So we have audience members that are really focused specifically on AI machine learning and copyright protections and how that conversation is evolving in sort of political and policy conversations in East Asia. Mikhail, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, this is a very it's a subject that's a top priority in the assemblies of South Korea and Taiwan. There has been a lot of debate. What is the correct approach to the topic? There are two main camps. One is more concerned about strict copyright protection, following the EU example. On the other hand, the critics of this focus on developing the local AI industries. There is a huge drive to establish big AI data centers throughout South Korea, for example, and they and the shift away from traditional data centers. Now, specifically concerning copyright, there is a concern that too many restrictions on the machine learning data of companies might not allow them to develop and stay competitive, especially vis-a-vis the Chinese companies, which do not face such restrictions for the US companies. At the same time, some proposals that concern stricter copyright restrictions, or even the companies to publicize their machine learning algorithms, are strongly suspected that they will handicap these companies by exposing their systems to competitors. For example, recently there was an attempt by the opposition in South Korea to enhance copyright protections for creators, and the committee that examined this was very critical, saying that this will severely hit the domestic AI industry. So it seems that South Korea is moving towards a more unregulated, not necessarily unregulated, but with lighter regulation on copyright restrictions. Now, on the other hand, in Taiwan, we have similar debates going on. The Taiwanese AI Basic Act comes in. There is a concern that it might overlap and slightly clash with privacy protections. These especially concerning health data, because if there's a concern that if health data is not protected adequately, this could have privacy concerns for Taiwanese citizens, and also create biases in the AI systems that Taiwanese companies are developing. So at the moment, the parliament is debating whether certain aspects of certain regulatory aspects should fall under the Privacy Act or the AI Act, and it's interesting to follow what the final decision might be.
Certainly does sound interesting. Thanks for that answer. We have another question that is focused on India's recent legislation relating to online gambling. How does that sort of legislative development affect sentiment around digital business regulation in the country and maybe even more broadly in the region?
Right. So, for context, for people who don't know, recently the Indian Parliament very quickly passed a blanket ban on all sorts of online gambling. So this they define as any game of chance which doesn't involve cannot directly be ranked using skill. This was very surprising because, just as an example, the Indian national cricket team, which is one of the richest teams in the world, from the richest boards in the world, was sponsored by one of these companies actively. So there wasn't really any sentiment against the online gambling industry that was visible, or there was any conversation around it. So in a lot of ways, this did come out very unexpectedly and out of the blue. Initially, in fact, a few years ago, the government was fairly receptive and accommodatory to online gambling businesses by tweaking regulations around in-person gambling to allow for online gambling to flourish. And it became one of the largest gambling industries in the world. So the suddenness of how quickly the restrictions were imposed has led to a bit of conversation and a bit of worry within digital media and digital businesses in India as a whole, because the lack of consultation that was undertaken and the very wide nature of the ban has led to a lot of online businesses being worried that similar steps might be taken without taking them into consideration before. To balance this, the government was fairly careful in its communication after the fact, where they specified the reasons being personal financial situations for people and large segments of the population becoming quite difficult. They quoted problems such as mental stress and even unfortunate cases where people took on debts to continue gambling and addiction as the reason behind this ban. So I think that was a way to decouple the conversation from digital media businesses as a whole, and to make it specifically about the dangers of gambling as an addiction. And then they used existing regulations against gambling in the country to justify this move. But businesses have also been quite critical of how the ban came in without any sort of public consultation or any chance for the businesses to alter their products before the ban comes in. And this has led to a general doubt over these kinds of knee-jerk reactions that the government might engage in while they are dealing with something very new and something that's developing in a very fast manner, which is also similar to how AI is going around. So it has brought that doubt in generally within investors, within businesses, that if AI becomes too difficult to deal with, the government will go for the hammer approach rather than being more nuanced and specific about it. From a regional perspective, India is kind of late to the party on this one because ASEAN was talking about online gambling for 5 or 6 years already by now. In a lot of jurisdictions, they've brought in a lot of regulations, but they've obviously made it very different from AI regulations as a whole. Um, Another interesting side note for which I believe was a reason that online gambling was outlawed the way it was in India is increasingly people's savings were going into gambling and not into either the financial markets, so through normal instruments like mutual funds or securities. And the government was increasingly worried that large segments of the population were losing money to a very small group of private investors. So if something similar happens with AI, we might see somewhat of a similar reaction. But because AI is such a big field and there are so many applications, I don't believe a similar ban can be enforced. And it will have to be a lot more nuanced and sensitive than this was. So it's an interesting example because there have been very few examples of such direct intervention against a specific industry within Indian legislation, especially in the last 11 years. So it does remind, I guess, businesses of the importance to follow these kinds of developments and understand where private conversations might be happening, and then kind of insulate them from these changes by knowing the right things.
Right, that's very interesting. Thanks for that bit of context. Sounds like a sort of swift and sweeping approach that could be a potentially narrative shifting development in the future. We're swiftly coming up on time here. And what I would love is to sort of wrap this conversation up with a bow and give a little look ahead to 2026 and beyond. Rather quickly, Mikhail, I'll start with you. Could you both give me an overview of what emerging trends you foresee in tech regulation across APAC and which countries you predict will really be leading these changes?
So looking to the future, I do think the main concern will be AI development. Now, regulations may come in the form of incentives for the development of AI data centers, uh, also regulations on how companies should handle sensitive data for their for uh, for the machine learning of their AI systems. This sensitive data could range from personal data privacy to copyright protections. So there will be a focus on that. And the idea will be, do we follow a more regulated approach as the EU or a more hands-off approach uh, as um, as the US and China do? Um, Another area of concern will be international tech competition, and well, I think most of the countries will try to take their own path, and kind of uh, stay independent from both the US and China while supporting their own domestic industries. But at the same time, they they will be influenced. So it will take a careful balancing act to successfully achieve this. Um,
Great, thank you. That's
yes.
interesting. Anything to add there, Rohil, as we sort of look ahead at the coming year?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with Mikhail's assessment of the general future, where um, countries will be very particular and specific in their approach to AI governance. This will reflect the domestic business interests that are in the country and the potential international investments that can be drawn based on different regulatory environments. As an example to what he said about changing regulatory approaches, Malaysia recently expanded on the strictness and the definitions of the Personal Data Protection Act, involving more regulations and more punishments for companies and businesses that fall afoul. So it isn't somewhat uniform where there is only a movement towards business-friendly practices. There is very much a balance which is very specific to each jurisdiction, where specific examples or very public incidents can also lead to regulatory changes that were otherwise unexpected. Um, on the broader US-China front, as we described before, there is clearly a interesting dynamic developing where countries will want to insulate themselves from this push-pull that the US and China seem to have, and will increasingly try to find the best deals they can at very specific tech-based levels or very specific goods and services-based levels. So yeah, it's an interesting time especially for the APAC region, as a lot of investments come in and go out, and it is definitely interesting to see where this will go.
Wonderful. Thank you both for those synopses. We are at time now, and this has been a very insightful conversation. Before we sign off, I do want to let you all know about Fiscal Note's platform Policy Note, which is helping government affairs teams to get ahead. Policy Note offers comprehensive policy data with built-in AI to summarize bills, create briefings, and draft position statements. Policy Note combines Fiscal Note's trusted policy and stakeholder data and CQ's news, analysis, and transcripts all in one. You can visit fiscalnote.com to learn more about how Policy Note can help you reach your goals. Thank you to our panelists for their time and willingness to share, and thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us today. I hope you have a fabulous remainder of your Wednesday. Thanks.